Hello, and welcome to Prickly, a podcast from KJZZ's Politics Desk. I'm Cameron Sanchez.
And I'm Wayne Schutsky.
There's a familiar character in Arizona politics who's now trying to exert influence over the Republican Party of Arizona, State Senator Jake Hoffman. Now, you might have heard of him from the Politics Desk's reports on his clashes with Democratic Governor Katie Hobbs, but he's also fashioning himself as something of a kingmaker. As the chair of the legislature's far-right Freedom Caucus, he started recruiting and endorsing candidates to run in several key races in Arizona next year. In some cases, those candidates are directly challenging other Republicans Hoffman says are unworthy of the party's support, setting up what's essentially a battle over the future of the Republican Party in the Grand Canyon state.
Today, we're going to address the candidates that Hoffman has recruited so far and explore what those candidates say about his vision for the future of the GOP in the state. But before we get into that, let me give you a little bit of an introduction into who Hoffman is and where he comes from. He's been a state lawmaker since about 2021, and before that, he was involved in politics at the local level, at the Higley School Board and the Queen Creek Town Council. But most folks probably know him from some of his more controversial moves recently. He has longstanding ties to Turning Point USA, which is a conservative group run by Charlie Kirk, based out of Scottsdale. That includes running a troll farm in 2020 during the presidential election between former President Biden and President Donald Trump. A troll farm is essentially a bunch of paid folks who are online pushing different messages in an attempt to sway public opinion one way or the other. In this case, it had to do with obviously some of the big issues in that presidential election, the COVID-19 pandemic and things like that. And obviously, Hoffman also is known as one of these so-called fake electors, or as they put it, alternative electors, who are currently facing felony charges for signing a document that falsely claimed Trump won the state of Arizona in 2020. Chris Mays, our Democratic Attorney General, brought those charges, and they're currently pending in a Maricopa County Superior Court. One other thing Hoffman mentioned in an interview with Cameron is that the Arizona Republican Party elected him as a national committeeman, sending him to the Republican National Convention last summer. So with all of this in mind, exactly how much influence does Hoffman have? And why is he pushing his preferred candidates in statewide races more than a year before those candidates could even appear on general election ballots in November 2026? Cameron sat down with Hoffman to ask those questions and dig a little deeper into his strategy to exert influence over a party that was once dominated by Republicans like the late U.S. Senator John McCain.
One thing that struck me with Hoffman as we sat down is that he's not shy about touting his bona fides and pushing himself as leader of the Republican Party in Arizona. And he was quick to bring up his election as national committeeman. It's a little-known role outside of these inner political circles, but it is something that he says comes with a lot of influence.
You have to remember, too, that my role as the highest ranking Republican man in the state of Arizona, I'm the national committeeman to the RNC for the Arizona Republican Party. That is a role of the party. That is a role of people who serve in positions like mine, is to make sure that we have good candidates, strong candidates that can win general elections. And so that plays a factor into this as well.
Hoffman is making a lot of waves beyond just this role in party leadership. We already mentioned he is the chair of the Freedom Caucus, which is a group of far-right Republicans who have a habit of creating rifts within the party by chastising other GOP legislators who don't align with their higher standards for Republican exceptionalism. He is also the chair of a state Senate committee, which is responsible for vetting Governor Hobbs's nominees to lead state agencies. And that's a role which has repeatedly put him in the spotlight. He says that it's his responsibility to the state to scrutinize the governor's, quote, woke and unqualified nominees. The governor calls him a partisan hack, hell-bent on disrupting her ability to govern. So when I asked Hoffman about how he came to occupy all these positions of power and authority in Republican Arizona politics, he said it's a calling from on high.
You know, I say God, that was my initial answer, because, look, I'm not doing anything greater or better than anybody else. But he keeps putting opportunities in front of me, and he says, if you'll do these and do them to the best of your abilities, he's like, I'm going to let you be successful. And I feel like that's what I've done.
We should note that Hoffman hasn't fielded a candidate for every office up for election next year. So far, he's made an endorsement in the governor's race, backed fellow state lawmaker Alexander Culloden for Secretary of State, and he's threatening to field a candidate to primary the incumbent GOP superintendent of public instruction. That's one of the reasons Cameron wanted to sit down with Hoffman to ask him about his decision-making process and the criteria for choosing these candidates.
Tell me more about the factors of a good candidate as opposed to a bad candidate. I mean, sometimes it's a Republican going against another Republican. So how do you know if the Republican is the right person?
Sure. Well, I mean, let's take the superintendent of public instruction position as kind of the petri dish for this conversation. We have a rogue superintendent of public instruction right now. He is a Republican. He is from my own party, and he is engaged in extra statutory. That means things that are outside the bounds of what statute allows him to do when it comes to the ESA program, right? ESA, Universal School Choice Program. It allows parents to choose the best educational environment for their children, no matter where that is.
So for some background on this, when Hoffman is talking about Superintendent Tom Horne's, quote, extra statutory activities, he is referring to some Republican frustrations with the state's school voucher program. Republicans in Hoffman's vein of the party argue there should be limited restrictions on what parents choose to do with, and I mean spend, their voucher checks on when it comes to educating their kids. And there's been a lot of rancor of updates to the Empowerment Scholarship Account Handbook, which is the how-to guide for parents when it comes to what they're allowed to buy with voucher dollars. So with all of that said, it is important to note that Horne is a big supporter of the school voucher program, and he has been from the get-go. So it was a bit shocking when Hoffman, last month, chose to publicly criticize Horne at a Capitol press conference. He described the superintendent as a chief antagonist of the voucher program, and since then, Hoffman made it really clear that he is hunting for a Republican to challenge Horne in next year's GOP primary election.
And that didn't play very well with Republicans who are not in the Freedom Caucus wing of the party because, to put it mildly, it's an unconventional move to challenge an incumbent Republican who's eligible to serve another term in office, especially one like Horne, who is a big defender of the voucher program. So does Hoffman worry that his candidates are causing strife inside the party?
Not so much, and he actually said that he doesn't consider himself to be far right, just right. And by that, he says he means the Freedom Caucus values are the best representation of the modern Republican Party platform.
And I think the reality is what unifies Republicans is when we have fidelity to the party platform, when we are honest brokers of the Constitution and the law, and we're not afraid to say so, right? And then obviously winning is certainly something that unifies the party.
Mm-hmm. But you yourself, I mean, you're divisive. And you know that, right? I mean, some people love you, and other people are always mad at you.
I wouldn't say I'm divisive. I would say that I'm honest. And sometimes honesty, and I think there's I don't know if it's a meme or an axiom that kind of floats around, right? But in a world of lies, honesty is considered divisive. And I think that's the reality is we live in an environment, we live in a culture right now that seeks the immediate and not the long term. And that seeks self-reinforcing, right? Self-reinforcing beliefs, self-reinforcing rhetoric. And so when you go against that trend, when you buck that, go against the grain, I guess, that can be seen by those who don't like it as divisive.
But when it comes down to winning elections, to some degree, candidates need to have more support than just one wing of one political party. Someone like failed gubernatorial and U.S. Senate candidate Kari Lake comes to mind. The support of the established state party in particular for funding, advertising, and endorsements is really important. There's also a history of so-called Freedom Caucus Republicans winning primaries at the state level, but not necessarily faring so well in the general elections that follow. What did Hoffman have to say about that?
Hoffman says his type of aggressive Freedom Caucus Republican is ready for prime time. And for evidence of that, he points to some candidates like President Donald Trump and even one-time Trump antagonist Ron DeSantis, who is the governor of Florida. Trump's far-right messages have clearly resonated off and on with voters, given his 2 wins and 1 loss at the national level, although Hoffman and other Republicans still dispute the 2020 defeat. But Hoffman says DeSantis is an interesting case study because when he first won election as governor in 2018, he barely won. And we're talking about a victory margin of less than 0.5% of a vote. And DeSantis didn't even eclipse 50% of the popular vote that year. Hoffman says DeSantis found greater success in 2022 when he won re-election by nearly 20 points because DeSantis evolved and took aggressive far-right positions.
Because he bucked the traditional political logic and instead said, no, I'm going to fearlessly fight for the people who elected me. I'm going to fearlessly fight for what's right, regardless of what the political class thinks. And I think we need to learn those lessons as a Republican Party. And we need to learn those lessons, quite frankly, just as a state. We need to elect people who, they might not always say things exactly how we want them to say it. But they're always going to fight for us. I think that's the best possible representative, no matter what office we're talking about, that we can have.
So we know that Hoffman is very particular about who he recruits and endorses, but there's one race Hoffman is staying out of next year. That's the race for Attorney General. It's an interesting window into Hoffman's process. There's a clear favorite in the Republican primary in Hoffman's colleague and fellow East Valley Republican, Senate President Warren Peterson. But Hoffman and Peterson haven't always seen eye to eye down at the legislature. And while Hoffman isn't fielding his own preferred candidate in the AG's race, he also notably has not yet endorsed Peterson.
Hoffman told me he is simply picking his battles and would rather focus on other races.
I think it's pretty clear where conservatives are going to fall. And I think it's pretty clear who's going to win that primary. So that's not one where we're, feeling like there's a great need to get involved.
Still, it's notable that while he's not backing Peterson, he is wholeheartedly endorsing another East Valley Republican, which is Congressman Andy Biggs, who announced in January that he'll run for governor.
The governor's office, obviously, we're excited about Andy Biggs. He has an incredible track record, 20 plus years in public service, was arguably the greatest Senate president. No shade thrown at our current Senate president, but Andy Biggs is just known as a phenomenal Senate president, worked well with both sides of the aisle, was an honest broker in everything that he did. He's been a great member of Congress, staunch ally of President Trump, and really cares about putting the people of Arizona first in our policy.
As national committeeman, Hoffman does have a role in state party leadership, but these endorsements he's making in the Republican Party primaries do fly in the face of some of these state GOP bylaws. Party chair Gina Swoboda takes the position that the party should treat all Republicans fairly in primaries. While Hoffman not only endorses candidates like Biggs, he also publicly attacked the other marquee GOP candidate running for governor, Karen Taylor Robeson. Hoffman says he and Swoboda just have a difference of opinion and approach.
The party has always, and party leaders have always endorsed, oftentimes it's in their personal capacity, right? In this case, I'm endorsing, candidates as a member of the legislature, as a Freedom Caucus member. Certainly, I am the national committeeman, and that has some weight. But the reality is party leaders have always endorsed. Legislative district parties have, routinely endorsed candidates, in many cases, entire slates, right?
Should we expect to see more Freedom Caucus candidates crop up going into the 2026 election?
Yes, Hoffman indicated he's got more irons in the fire, and so far we've been focusing on the big statewide races, but he said he has his eyes on legislative races in particular.
And obviously, the legislature is an incredibly important, set of races, right? There's 90 races that happen every 2 years for that. Look, what we've seen is we picked up a couple of seats. The midterms probably going to be midterms are generally a more challenging election cycle than a presidential cycle for Republicans, especially when we sweep top of the ticket. And so, legislature and making sure that we have good candidates who are willing to push back on special interest and willing to fight for the people, we're going to be looking at those very closely.
Thank you, Senator Hoffman, for sitting down to chat with us, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Prickly Podcast from KJZZ's Politics Desk. Tune into 91.5 to hear our coverage of the ongoing legislative session and more, or log on to kjzz.org.
And please subscribe to the Prickly Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.